Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Muhammad Najahan bin Khairul Jarin, matrix number 1212010. Today I would like to review a book that has been chosen by us, which is The Educational Philosophy and Practice of Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas, and an exposition of the original concept of Islamization. And now I would like to talk about the chapter 1, about metaphysical worldview. Before we move to the next topics, in this chapter there's three main agenda I would like to discuss, I would like to review, which is the introduction, the 5 ideas or 5 points, and lastly the conclusion. Moving to the first agenda in this chapter, which is introduction. The writers start this chapter with some history that happened in 19th century, that the economic backwards and political weaknesses of the Muslim that happened because of the subjugation by the Western colonial powers. This made many Muslim leaders spread to clamor for internal changes to close the humiliating gap between them and the Western. For almost 3 decades, Professor Syed Naqib Al-Attas has consistently argued that the most fundamental and best reason for this condition is the problem of the content of education. There's many suggestions from Professor Syed Naqib Al-Attas about this problem, and this chapter will discuss the outline of the metaphysics of Islam as understood and exposed by Al-Attas. Moving to our first ideas, which is metaphysics generally. Um, the author try to define the metaphysics in general, that which is concerned with the nature of ultimate reality, and in the Islamic sense, metaphysics, which includes of course the original meaning of the term theology, that most important because it determines the Muslim conception of the universe, human psychology, epistemology, ethics, and even logic. Moving to the next ideas, which is metaphysics of Naqib Al-Attas. In these topics, the author has defined a metaphysic as understood and exposed by Al-Attas, which is the synthesis of ideas and theories that have been traditionally upheld by Muslim theologian, which is mutakallimun. The elements and the elaboration of these metaphysics are found scattered in his definitive commentaries on the two greatest scholars of Malay world, Hamzah Fansuri and Nur ad-Din al-Raniri. His articulation on Islam are based on his interpretation of the Quran and Sunnah. Also, his interpretation of the former two basic sources of Islam based on the traditional methods of tafsir and ta'wil. From this slide, we can see that Naqib Al-Attas has systemized these ideas and elements in a series of monographs. Islam, the concept of religion, and the foundation of ethics and morality, 1976, and many more. Moving to the next ideas, which is tafsir and ta'wil. In these topics, the author try to elaborate about the tafsir and ta'wil, that tafsir of the Quran is precise and is not subject to error because it deals with the clear verse from Muhammad, whose meaning must be based on the clear verse of the Quran and the hadith of the Holy Prophet. Many of the Quranic at the last 2 centuries has carried out by Muslim according to Al-Attas, and they are not really a tafsir, precisely because they do not strictly adhere to the stated criterion, even though to who seeks to interpret the ambiguous mutashabihat verses, still it must consider the relevant clear ones for support. To the next idea, which is higher Sufis. The writer has stated about the higher Sufis that Al-Attas believe they has been misunderstood, even though uh, he acknowledged Ibn Khaldun insight into the psychology of the Sufis. Attas criticized the latter for not differentiating between the doctrines of different level of Sufis, which is between the pseudo-Sufis, the ignorant, and the highest one. Attas, following Al-Raniri and many intellectual Sufi before him, on the other hand, constantly distinguishes between the ideas and teaching of the higher Sufis from those of the pseudo-Sufis, such as Sufastiyya and Wujudiyya Mulhida. The ideas of practices of the former group are firmly rooted in knowledge, which is based ultimately on initiative experience. Like they believe the pseudo Sufis uphold their major doctrines, that God is one or identical with or incarnated in His creatures, um, and other example, they are also uphold that the external world, including man, is illusory. From that, some of them also reject religious laws from which they claim that they are exempted. Therefore, they do things like reject prayers, for example, and contend that contemplation is sufficient instead. They likewise emulate laziness as way of life, encouraging begging and soliciting alms and charity. Moving to the last ideas, which is Sufism or Tasawwuf. According to Al-Attas, Sufism or Tasawwuf be defined as a practice, as the practice of Sharia at the station, which is Maqam of Ihsan. And the author clearly said that his definition is significant because it automatically integrates the spiritual with the legal, two dimensions which are organically linked in Islam. By ihsan, he meant the highest stage of religious life, as conveyed by the famous hadith narrated by Umar ibn al-Khattab and transmitted by Abu Hurairah, in which the Prophet said of ihsan that you should worship God as if you saw Him. And also, Attas asserted that no formulation of philosophy of education and philosophy of science along Islamic lines can be developed by ignoring the great contribution of the Sufi masters on the ultimate nature of reality. Finally, the conclusion. In this chapter, we can conclude that the author trying to tell us about the metaphysics in general and how Professor Syed Muhammad Naqib Al-Attas defined metaphysics in Islam especially, and use two traditional methods, tafsir and ta'wil. And after that, the author also told us about higher Sufis and Sufism or Tasawwuf.